Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are not just opening a history book, we're really prying open a case file on what you could call a geopolitical earthquake, all contained within the life of a single person.
That's a great way to put it.
We're talking about a figure who didn't just document the 20th century. I mean, you could argue he grabbed the steering wheel of history and yanked it in a completely different direction. We're talking about Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn.
It's so hard to find a modern comparison for him. I mean, in the literary world, we talk about books that are important or moving, books that win big prizes.
Right.
But Solzhenitsyn's work, his nonfiction especially, like the Gulag Archipelago, that was something else entirely. It wasn't just a book. As our source material puts it, it was a head-on challenge to the Soviet state.
It was a weapon.
It absolutely was a weapon.
That's the image that really stuck with me reading through these sources. You've got this nuclear superpower, the Soviet Union, at the absolute height of its power. It's armed with ICBMs. It's got the KGB.
The whole apparatus of a totalitarian state.
And on the other side, you have one guy with a pen, some manuscripts he's hiding, and, a beard. And somehow, the guy with the pen wins.
He wins by delegitimizing the entire moral authority of the communist project. He dismantled it piece by piece with words. And he did it by sheer force of will.
And the numbers are just staggering.
Oh, yeah. The Gulag Archipelago sold tens of millions of copies around the world. It forced the West, which had been, let's be honest, a little willfully blind to the Soviet reality.
Or at least willing to look the other way for political reasons.
Exactly. It forced them, and eventually the Soviet Union itself, to look the monster right in the mirror. But, and this is so crucial for our deep dive today, Solzhenitsyn is often just flattened into a caricature.
Right, he becomes the Gulag guy. That's all people know. Or the angry prophet ranting in the woods in Vermont.
Exactly, the gloomy dissident. But the whole mission of this deep dive is to get past that label. We need to understand the transformation, Because he didn't start out as a dissident. He started as a loyal Marxist soldier.
That's the part that's so hard to wrap your head around.
So we need to trace how a decorated Red Army captain, a true believer, turns into a spiritual dissident. And then, maybe even more surprisingly, how that dissident becomes this ferocious critic of the West the moment he's finally free.
That's the twist that I think really trips a lot of people up. You expect the narrative to be so simple. He escapes the evil empire, he comes to the West, he loves democracy, and lives happily ever after. But Solzhenitsyn gets to the West and says, hold on a minute, you guys have some massive problems too.
He was a completely equal opportunity critic, absolutely.
And just on a pure story level, looking at the biographical data, his life is a spy thriller. I'm not even exaggerating.
No, it's all there.
I mean, we are talking about assassination attempts by the KGB using, of all things, ricin on a crowded street. We're talking about manuscripts buried in friends' gardens, secret codes and letters, betrayals. It's just intense stuff.
It is a thriller. But it's a thriller with a very, very specific moral center, and I think that's key. When he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970, the citation, it honored the ethical force with which he pursued the great traditions of Russian literature.
Ethical force, I like that.
I want us to keep that phrase, ethical force, in our minds for this whole discussion, because his entire worldview, everything he wrote, it all boils down to one almost terrifyingly simple conclusion. That the root of all the 20th century's disasters, the wars, the camps, the genocide, was that men had forgotten God.
So, okay, let's unpack that ethical force then and figure out where it came from. Because as you said, he didn't just pop out of the womb a religious philosopher.
Yeah.
If we look at the origin section of our sources, I mean, on paper, young Alexander looks like the perfect model Soviet citizen.
On paper, yes. But if you just scratch the surface, there was this massive, massive contradiction right there from the very beginning. He was born in Kislovodsk in 1918. Now, just pause and think about what 1918 in Russia means.
It's the Civil War. It's total chaos.
Absolute chaos. The Bolsheviks are fighting the whites. The old world is burning down. And Solzhenitsyn creates his first fiction, as he called it, just by being born.
What do you mean by that?
Well, his father, Isaki, had died in a hunting accident 6 months before Alexander was even born, which is tragic enough. But the really dangerous part was his father's identity. He was an officer in the old Imperial Russian Army.
Strike one.
And he was of Cossack origin.
Okay, that's strike two in the new Soviet world.
Big time. And then strike three was his mother's family. They weren't just, regular people. They were wealthy landowners in the Kuban region. In the Bolshevik worldview, these people were the enemy. They were class enemies, the oppressors who had to be swept away.
So his very existence is a political liability.
A huge one. So his mother, Tasia, she had to perform this lifelong magic trick. She had to scrub their entire family history. She raised him in poverty deliberately just to blend in, hiding the fact that he was the son of an imperial officer and the grandson of a wealthy landowner.
It's fascinating because she wasn't just hiding his class background. She was trying to preserve a whole different set of values, wasn't she? The sources mentioned she was devoutly religious.
She was, deeply. She raised him in the Russian Orthodox faith, but it had to be done in secret. So you have to picture this young boy growing up in a house full of icons and whispers about God and prayers.
And then he walks out the front door.
And he walks out the door into the Soviet education system. And that system was an unbelievably efficient machine for churning out atheists. It was its primary function, really.
And with him, it worked. That's the wild part. Despite his mother's best efforts, young Alexander buys what the state is selling, hook, line, and sinker.
He buys it completely. He becomes a committed atheist. He becomes a true believer in Marxism-Leninism. He goes off to Rostov State University to study math and physics, which seems, apolitical.
Sure, numbers are numbers.
But at the same time, he's taking correspondence courses from the Moscow Institute of Philosophy, Literature, and History. He's steeping himself in the ideology.
He's drowning himself in it.
He is. He admitted later in his life that until the day he was arrested, he never once truly questioned the moral superiority of the Soviet Union. He really thought they were building the future, a better world.
So again, not a rebel waiting for his moment. He was a true believer.
100%. And he proved it when the war started, World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, as they called it. He didn't try to dodge the draft. He wanted in.
He demanded to go.
He did. He eventually served as the commander of a sound-ranging battery in the Red Army.
Okay, so just to clarify for the listener, a sound-ranging battery, that's not frontline infantry charging with a bayonet, right? It's more of a technical role.
It's highly technical. It's essentially using acoustics, the sound of enemy cannons firing, to triangulate their position so you can fire back accurately. It required very advanced mathematics. It was really the perfect job for a math and physics student like him.
And by all accounts, he was good at it. Captain Solzhenitsyn was a model officer.
He was excellent at it. He was decorated twice. He received the Order of the Red Star and another major decoration for specifically destroying German artillery batteries. He was a competent, brave, loyal Soviet officer. He had the shoulder boards, the respect, the command. He was on the winning team.
But the sources seem to point to his time in East Prussia, right at the end of the war, as the moment where the armor starts to crack a little. He's marching into Germany. The Red Army is winning, but he sees something that really shakes him to his core.
Yeah, this is what the sources call the witness to atrocity phase. And you have to understand the atmosphere in early 1945. The Soviet propaganda machine, led by writers like Ilya Ehrenberg, was just whipping up this frenzy of pure vengeance. The message was simple: kill the German.
So when the Soviet troops finally cross into Germany proper, into East Prussia, it's just a release of pure rage.
An explosion of it. And Solzhenitsyn is right there, watching his own troops do this. He's watching looting, wanton destruction, and most horrifyingly, the mass rape of German women and girls. And it wasn't just German, sometimes Polish women who were mistaken for Germans. He later wrote a very long, very dark poem about this experience called Prussian Nights.
I was reading some excerpts of that poem. It is not a glorious war poem. It's gruesome.
It's a confession. It's a piece of self-laceration. He describes the gang rape of a woman, and the narrator, who is clearly Solzhenitsyn himself, is an officer just standing there. He doesn't stop it. He just watches.
Wow.
And later, looking back on this moment in the Gulag Archipelago, he asks this absolutely haunting question. He asks, so were we any better?
That is such a heavy, heavy realization for a guy who grew up believing the Soviet Union was the absolute pinnacle of human morality. To look at your own side and see monsters.
It's the beginning of his moral awakening. He starts to realize that good and evil aren't just neat labels you can put on us and them, but, and this is the incredible irony, he didn't get arrested for objecting to war crimes. He didn't get arrested for trying to save civilians.
No, he got arrested for being an arrogant young intellectual who thought he was smarter than the system. This is the part that just drives me crazy reading it. He's writing these letters to his friend from school, Nikolai Vitkevich, right?
Yes, this is in February of 1945. Victory in Europe is just a couple of months away, and he and Vitkevich are exchanging these long philosophical letters where they're critiquing the conduct of the war, and crucially, they're critiquing Stalin personally.
But they thought they were being so clever. They used code names for him.
This is the absolute hubris of the intellectual. They referred to Stalin as Hosien, which means the boss, or Balbos, which is a Yiddish word for master of the house. They even called him Pakhan, which is like a mafia boss.
Right.
They honestly thought, we're so clever, the dull-witted military censors will never figure out who we're talking about.
As if the secret police wouldn't immediately realize who the boss was in 1945 Russia. It's just, it's madness.
Exactly. SIM-UR-SH, the military counterintelligence agency, whose name literally means death to spies, was not stupid. They were reading everything. And they didn't just find a few insults about Stalin. They found something much, much worse in those letters.
This is the resolution number 1.
That's it. They found that Solzhenitsyn and Vitkovich had drafted something called Resolution Number 1. It was a sketch, a program for forming a new post-war organization to, in their words, fix the Soviet regime.
Oh, that's it. That's the ball game.
In the paranoid mind of the Stalinist state, that isn't just grumbling. That's a conspiracy. That's a coup in the making.
So paint the scene for us. It's February 1945. He's a decorated captain on the front lines. What actually happens? How do they get him?
He's summoned by his brigade commander. He thinks he's just being called in for new orders or a promotion maybe. He walks into the headquarters, he salutes. And suddenly, 2 SMERISH officers step out from the shadows. They physically rip the shoulder boards off his uniform. They take his pistol. Wow.
In that one split second, the decorated captain is dead. The prisoner is born.
That physical act, ripping the rank off his shoulders, it's so symbolic. You are no longer a person in the system's eyes. You are just meat for the grinder now.
And he's taken away, eventually ending up in the infamous Ludyanka prison in Moscow. And there is one visual detail from the source material that I think is the most cinematic, most soul-crushing moment of his entire early life.
Victory Day.
Victory Day. May 9th, 1945. The war in Europe is over. Nazi Germany has surrendered. All of Moscow is exploding with joy. There are fireworks. There are searchlights sweeping the sky. People are dancing and singing in the streets. There are 30-gun salutes. It's the biggest party in Russian history. And Solzhenitsyn is in a cell in the Lubyanka.
Which is right in the center of Moscow.
Right in the dead center. He can see the flashes of the fireworks through the tiny barred window of his cell. He could hear the roar of the crowd. And he wrote, "There was no rejoicing in our cells. That victory was not ours."
Unbelievable. I mean, can you just imagine the bitterness? You fought for that victory. You helped destroy those German guns. And now, while the entire country celebrates, you are sitting in the dark, labeled a traitor by the very system you served.
That moment right there, it has to be the final closing of the door on the believer. You can't be a Marxist true believer when the system you worship has just thrown you in a cage while celebrating the victory you helped secure.
It forces a total, radical reset of his entire worldview. And this leads us directly into part 2, the education of the soul. The Gulag years.
Right, so he gets convicted under Article 58, which was the classic catch-all for anti-Soviet propaganda. He gets a sentence of 8 years. But his experience wasn't, let's say, the typical Gulag experience, was it? At least not at first. He didn't go straight to the mines.
No, not immediately. And this is a really fascinating nuance of the Soviet system's strange, brutal logic. Because he was a mathematician and a physicist, the state decided he was too valuable to just work to death chopping down trees in a forest. So they put him in a sharashka.
Okay, you have to explain the sharashka. It sounds like a made-up word from a fantasy novel.
It's slang, but it basically means a special scientific prison. These were facilities run by the Ministry of State Security, where all the prisoners were top-tier scientists, engineers, and mathematicians, and they were forced to work on secret government projects.
What kind of projects?
Oh, all sorts. Developing secure encryption devices for telephones, which is what Solzhenitsyn did. Designing new aircraft, even working on the early stages of the nuclear program.
So it's slave labor, but it's intellectual slave labor. You're a prisoner, but you're a prisoner with a slide rule.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's what Dante called the first circle of hell. In fact, that's where the title of his novel, In the First Circle, comes from.
Ah, okay.
It's hell, but it's the best part of hell. The source material says they had butter sometimes, they had worn sheets, they weren't freezing to death or starving, but the psychological torture was unique. You are using your brain, your most precious faculty, to strengthen the very regime that has unjustly imprisoned you. You are literally building the locks for your own cell and for millions of others.
That's a brutal moral compromise. I will help you oppress people more efficiently so that I can have an extra piece of bread and some butter.
Precisely. And Solzhenitsyn wrestled with that every single day. He met a man there named Lev Kopelev who became the basis for the character Lev Rubin in his book. They debated these things endlessly, but eventually Solzhenitsyn's principles got him in trouble. He had a dispute with the authorities, and in the completely arbitrary nature of the Gulag,
He got kicked out of the good prison.
he got kicked out. In 1950, he was transferred to a special camp in a place called Ekibastos in Kazakhstan.
And the special camp is exactly what we imagine when we say the word gulag.
This was the real thing. This was the hard reality. No more encryption projects. Now he was a miner, he was a bricklayer, he was a foundry foreman. The cold was just unimaginable, minus 40 degrees. The mortar you were using to lay bricks would freeze before you could get the next brick on top of it if you weren't fast enough.
And the sources say this is where one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich was really born. It wasn't fiction, it was just reportage.
It was his life. Every single detail in that book, sewing a piece of bread into your mattress so it won't be stolen, the desperate, all-consuming desire for an extra bowl of thin soup, the way the cold physically hurts your lungs to breathe. Solzhenitsyn lived every second of that at Ekibastos. This was the absolute bottom of the barrel.
And as if that wasn't enough, just to add insult to injury, biology decides to attack him too.
Yeah, this is the moment that almost ended the story before it could even begin. He developed a tumor. He had it removed there in the camp, but the conditions were obviously primitive. It wasn't properly diagnosed as cancerous.
Then his 8-year sentence finally ends in 1953, and Stalin dies in March of that same year. So Solzhenitsyn is released from the camp, but he's not. He's not free.
No. He's sent into internal exile in perpetuity.
Perpetuity, that means forever.
Forever. He was sent to a tiny remote village called Burlik in southern Kazakhstan. He was a non-person. He had to report to the local commandant regularly, and that is when the cancer came back.
And this time it was aggressive.
It was aggressive. He was in immense pain. He couldn't eat. He was wasting away. He was essentially sent there to die alone in a mud hut in the middle of nowhere.
But somehow he manages to get to a clinic in Tashkent.
In 1954, yes. He gets permission to travel to a cancer ward. And the doctors there, using massive doses of radiation therapy, somehow managed to put the tumor into remission. By all accounts, it was a medical miracle, but for Solzhenitsyn, it was a spiritual miracle.
Right, this is the spiritual shift the outline talks about. We need to really understand this. How does surviving cancer change his politics, or is it more than that?
It was so much more than politics. It was metaphysics. He came to believe, with every fiber of his being, that his life had been given back to him for a specific purpose. He had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, first the war, then the camp, and now the cancer, and he had survived. It was in that cancer ward that he abandoned the last remnants of Marxism.
And returned to his childhood faith.
He returned to the Orthodox Christianity of his mother, but with the white-hot zeal of a convert. He saw it all clearly now.
He has that famous realization around this time. He stops blaming the system, Stalin, the party, and he starts looking inward at himself.
Yes, this is the absolute core of his philosophy. He looked back at his own behavior as a Red Army captain, how arrogant he'd been, how he had ignored the suffering of those German civilians, and he wrote that famous line, maybe his most famous. The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart.
And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart.
Exactly. That's the conclusion. You can't fix society by killing the bad class or the bad guys. You have to start by fixing the human soul, your own soul, first. So when he walks out of that cancer ward in Tashkent, he is a completely changed man. He has a mission. He is going to bear witness.
Which brings us to part 3. The writer who broke the silence. This is the era of the Khrushchev thaw. It's the late 50s, early 60s. The Soviet Union is trying in its own way to de-Stalinize.
Right. Nikita Khrushchev is in power, and he wants to distance himself and the party from Stalin's worst crimes, partly to consolidate his own control. He needs a weapon, a tool to bash the hardline Stalinists with. And Solzhenitsyn, who is now working as a humble high school physics teacher and writing in absolute secrecy at night, provides that weapon.
He submits one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich to Novi Mir, which was the big literary journal at the time.
It was a massive, massive risk. He was completely convinced he would just be arrested again and sent back. But the editor, a man named Twardovsky, loved it. He saw its power, and he passed it up the chain of command all the way until it landed on Khrushchev's own desk. And Khrushchev, amazingly, personally approved it for publication.
That is just wild to me. The head of the Soviet state approving a book that exposes the Soviet camp system.
Well, Khrushchev famously said to the Politburo in a closed session, "There's a Stalinist in each of you. We must root out this evil." He wasn't a liberal. He was using Solzhenitsyn as a political bludgeon against his rivals.
And when it was published in 1962, the reaction was, well, it was explosive.
It was an earthquake. You have to remember, everyone knew about the camps on some level. Everyone had a cousin or a neighbor who had disappeared. But no one ever spoke about it. It was the great public secret. And suddenly, here it is, in print, in an official magazine. People were reading it on street corners, in the metro. They were weeping. It was this moment of collective national catharsis. Solzhenitsyn became an overnight celebrity.
But in the Soviet Union, the political winds can change very, very fast.
Unbelievably fast. By 1964, Khrushchev is ousted in a palace coup. Brezhnev comes in, and the thaw immediately turns into a deep, hard freeze. The new regime decides they've had more than enough of this truth-telling.
And Solzhenitsyn goes from being a celebrity back to being a pariah.
Almost overnight, they stop publishing his work. The KGB starts an active campaign of harassment against him. They start seizing his papers. In 1965, they raid a friend's house, and they find the manuscript of Grust in the first circle. The noose is tightening.
Okay, so this is where the story becomes about the mechanics of writing the Gulag Archipelago. He knows he's being watched, he knows they want to silence him, but he's secretly working on this massive, multi-volume history of the entire camp system. How did he physically do it?
It's an incredible story of literary tradecraft. He wrote it in secret between 1958 and 1967. He called it a literary investigation. He didn't just use his own memory, his own experience. He secretly interviewed 256 other former prisoners.
How do you even do that under KGB surveillance?
Very, very carefully. He would meet them on park benches, in crowded train stations, places where they could blend in. He couldn't take notes openly, so he had to memorize their stories. Then he would rush home and write it all down.
And the manuscript itself, the physical pages.
He couldn't keep it in one place. That would be suicide. So he had this network of incredibly brave friends. He called them the Invisibles. He would type out sections using single spacing on both sides of the paper to make it as compact as possible. And then these friends would take the pages and hide them.
Where?
All over. They buried copies in glass jars in their gardens. They hid them in hollowed-out furniture. They hid them in basements in different cities. He was writing a 2,000-page book that was physically scattered all across the Soviet Union.
It's like a spy ring, but for literature.
Exactly. And then the tragedy happens, the story of Elizaveta Voronyanskaya. This part of the story just breaks my heart every time I read it. It's the most painful chapter in the book's entire history. Elizaveta was one of his most trusted typists and assistants. She had a copy of the manuscript hidden in her apartment. And in August of 1973, the KGB picked her up.
And they didn't just, ask her nicely where it was.
No. They interrogated her for 5 days straight, without sleep, just relentless psychological and physical pressure. She was an elderly woman. She finally broke. She told them where the manuscript was hidden.
And the aftermath of that.
The KGB went to her apartment. They dug up the manuscript from its hiding place, and then they let her go. She went home, and she hanged herself.
Oh, God. The guilt Solzhenitsyn must have felt from that.
It was devastating for him, but it also clarified everything. He realized the game was over. He had been holding back the publication of the Gulag Archipelago in the West to protect the people who were named in the book. But now the KGB had the text. They knew the names.
So the risk was already there.
The risk was already realized. He said, essentially, they have the book. The world should have it too. He sent the signal, a prearranged code word, to his contacts in Paris to publish immediately.
But before we get to the publication, we have to talk about the assassination attempt. Because while all this manuscript drama is happening, the KGB also tried to solve the Solzhenitsyn problem the old-fashioned way.
Yes, this was in August of 1971. This is straight out of a Cold War spy novel. They couldn't just shoot him in the street because by this point he was too famous. He'd won the Nobel Prize in 1970, even though he couldn't go to Stockholm to collect it.
Right, it would be too obvious.
Too obvious. So they tried to desettle. KGB agents followed him to a department store in the city of Novocherkassk. While he was in the crowd, one of them bumped into him and, with a hidden device, injected him with a dose of ricin.
Ricin,
Yeah.
the poison made from castor beans. Highly lethal.
Highly lethal. And they use what the sources describe as a gel-based delivery method, so it would absorb slowly and be hard to trace. He fell violently ill a few days later. His skin was covered in burns and boils. He was bedridden for months and in agonizing pain. But unbelievably, he survived.
The man is just indestructible. He survives the war, he survives the camps, he survives cancer, and now he survives a KGB hit squad.
It just reinforced his belief that he was being protected by God for a purpose, that he had a mission to complete.
So 1974, the Gulag Archipelago is published in the West. It hits the world like a meteor. The Soviet leadership is absolutely furious. They debate what to do with him, arrest him again, kill him for real this time, send him back to Siberia.
They were completely stuck. If they killed him, he becomes an eternal martyr. If they imprison him, the West will never shut up about it. So Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB at the time, comes up with a different, and in their minds, cleverer solution: expulsion.
Which brings us to part 4, exile. In February of 1974, they arrest him one last time. They strip him of his Soviet citizenship, put him on a plane, and literally just drop him in West Germany.
He is free, but he's a man without a country. He eventually moves to Zurich, and then, looking for more privacy and quiet, he settles in, of all places, Cavendish, Vermont.
I just love the image of this great Russian prophet, this Old Testament figure living in the quiet green woods of Vermont. He builds a big fence around his property, locks the gate, and just keeps writing.
But the KGB didn't just leave him alone, did they? Even in Vermont.
Oh, no. Andropov was obsessed with him. The KGB ran what they called active measures to harass and discredit him, even in America. They sent him letters forged to look like they were from unhinged lunatics. They mailed him anonymous photographs of car crashes and gruesome brain surgery just to mess with his head.
Psychological warfare.
Totally. They tried to make him paranoid that his neighbors and his American assistants were all CIA or KGB agents.
Which, to be fair, in the middle of the Cold War was not an entirely invalid paranoia to have. No, it wasn't. The sources suggest that at least 3 people in his immediate circle in Vermont were, in fact, informants for various agencies.
But the biggest shock for the West wasn't that the KGB hated him. It was that he didn't seem to love the West all that much either.
This is the absolute crux of the Solzhenitsyn paradox. The West welcomed him as a hero. They had this very simple equation in their heads. He hates communism, therefore he must love consumer capitalism.
And then came the Harvard Address in 1978.
A legendary moment. It's a rainy day. You have the entire intellectual elite of America sitting there in their academic robes at Harvard University. They invite him to give the commencement speech. They are ready to be praised. They are expecting him to say, "Thank you for your freedom. You are the shining city on the hill."
And instead, he gets up to the podium and essentially pulls out a flamethrower.
He absolutely scolds them. He goes down a list. He critiques the West for what he calls a decline in courage, especially among the ruling and intellectual elites. He attacks the pervasive materialism, the idea that the goal of human life is just to own more stuff. He attacks the spiritual vapidity of pop culture, specifically citing TV stupor and intolerable music.
But the part that I found most interesting, and honestly the most relevant to today, is his critique of what he called legalism. Can we dig into that for a minute?
This is such a profound point he makes. Solzhenitsyn argued that Western society had fundamentally replaced morality with legality. He told the crowd, "I have spent all my life under a communist regime where the law did not matter. But you people have the opposite problem. You worship the law."
What does he mean by that exactly?
He meant that in the West, if something is legal, people automatically assume that it is right. He said, and I'm quoting from the source here, "A society which is based on the letter of the law and never reaches any higher is taking very scarce advantage of the high level of human possibilities."
So he's saying that just relying on the law as your guide is a very low bar for a civilization to set for itself.
The dangerously low bar.
Yeah.
He's saying that if your only standard for behavior is, will I get sued for this, or is this technically allowed by the rules, then you have a gaping hole in your soul as a society. He believed that voluntary self-restraint, a sense of higher moral duty, was far more important than a long list of legal rights.
And then he delivers the killer line.
He does. He told the audience, "Should someone ask me whether I would indicate the West, such as it is today, as a model to my country, frankly, I would have to answer negatively."
Can you just imagine the stunned silence in that crowd? He's telling them, thanks for the rescue, but I do not want Russia to become like you.
It was a profound shock to the system for a lot of people, but he was being completely consistent. In his mind, the East had forgotten God because the state had forced them to. The West had forgotten God because they were too busy shopping and filing lawsuits against each other. To him, both systems were spiritually hollow, just in different ways.
This really helps explain why his specific political views in exile were so confusing and often offensive to people in the West. He went to Spain after the dictator Franco died, and he basically told the liberals to calm down and not change things too quickly.
Yes, he warned them not to push too hard for rapid democracy. He claimed, controversially, that Spain under Franco had more freedoms than the USSR ever did. He saw the Spanish Civil War through the lens of the Russian Civil War. He viewed the Republicans, the leftists, as the same destructive force that destroyed Russia. So he tended to side with the nationalists as the lesser of two evils.
Which got him labeled a fascist by some.
Winston Lord, a prominent U.S. diplomat at the time, called him just about a fascist, but that's a misreading, I think. Solzhenitsyn wasn't a fascist. He was a terrified anti-communist. He saw communism as the ultimate singular evil in the world, so he was willing to support almost any authoritarian regime if they held the line against the Reds.
It's the same logic with Vietnam. He supported the American war effort.
He did, passionately. When the U.S. pulled out, he called the peace accords a hasty capitulation and a betrayal. He accused the U.S. of abandoning 30 million people to genocide and re-education camps. He wasn't thinking about American domestic politics or the draft. He was thinking about the people who would be left behind. To him, the U.S. withdrawal was just more proof of that declining courage he talked about at Harvard.
He also had this very, very specific view of Russia versus the Soviet Union. He hated when people used those terms interchangeably.
That is a crucial distinction for understanding him. He was a passionate Russian nationalist, but he was also an anti-imperialist. He argued that the Soviet Union wasn't Russia, it was a cancer growing on Russia. He believed that ethnic Russians were actually the most oppressed and brutalized group within the USSR, and that communism itself was a foreign Western ideology imported to destroy his country.
So he wanted to strip away the non-Russian parts of the empire in order to save the Russian nation.
Exactly. He wanted Russia to look inward, to heal its own soul, not to waste its strength and blood trying to run an empire in Eastern Europe or Central Asia.
Which brings us to the final act of his life, Part 5, The Return. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991. The thing he fought against his entire life actually falls apart.
It's incredible. And in 1994, his citizenship is restored and he finally goes home. But he doesn't just fly into the airport in Moscow. He flies to the Russian Far East, to the city of Magadan, the historical heart of the Gulag system, and he takes a train across the entire country to Moscow.
He wants to see the patient up close.
He wants to take the pulse of the nation he's been dreaming of for 20 years. But what he found when he got there broke his heart all over again.
He didn't like the new Russia either.
He hated it. This was the Yeltsin era. This was shock therapy economics. You had a handful of oligarchs looting all the state assets, and you had mass poverty everywhere else. He saw it as utter chaos and moral decay. He felt they just traded the tyranny of the party for the tyranny of money. He bitterly criticized the awkward and corrupt exit from communism.
He even had his own TV show for a while, right? Which just sounds bizarre.
He did. He had a 15-minute slot where he would just sit there in a chair and deliver these monologues about the moral state of the nation. But it was canceled after about a year. The sad truth is, the new generation of Russians didn't want to be scolded by this grim grandpa figure. They wanted MTV and Levi's jeans.
But there was one person in power who was listening, Vladimir Putin.
This is a very complex relationship that we need to navigate carefully, just reporting what the sources say. Solzhenitsyn, in his later years, became a supporter of Vladimir Putin.
Why? I mean, Putin was a career KGB man. That seems like the ultimate contradiction.
It does on the surface, but you have to look at it through Solzhenitsyn's eyes. He despised the chaos and what he saw as the humiliation of Russia during the Yeltsin years. He believed Russia needed a strong state to hold it together and restore its dignity. He saw Putin as a fellow Russian nationalist who was restoring order and national pride. Putin, in turn, cultivated this relationship and visited Solzhenitsyn at his home.
It's a huge contrast to how he treated Yeltsin. He refused an award from Yeltsin, didn't he?
Yes. He publicly refused the Order of St. Andrew from Yeltsin, saying, and I quote, "I am unable to receive an award from a government that had led Russia into such dire straits." But he later accepted a major state prize from Putin. He felt Putin was steering the ship of state away from the rocks that Yeltsin had run it onto.
Now, we do have to address some of the major controversies in his later writings, specifically his views regarding Ukraine and the Jewish people. The source material is very clear that these views cause a lot of friction and criticism.
They did, and it's important to report them accurately as part of his overall intellectual makeup. So, regarding Ukraine, Solzhenitsyn was what you might call a pan-Slavist. He fundamentally viewed Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians as one people, separated by politics.
So he didn't really believe in the legitimacy of an independent Ukrainian nation.
He called the talk of a separate Ukrainian people a recently invented falsehood. He warned constantly against what he saw as extreme Ukrainian nationalism. However, when it came to the Holodomor, the Great Famine of the 1930s, he acknowledged that 6 million people died and he squarely blamed the Bolshevik system. But he argued it wasn't an ethnic genocide targeting Ukrainians specifically. He saw it as the system's war against the peasantry of all ethnicities, Russian and Ukrainian alike.
And then there's the very controversial book, 200 Years Together.
Yes, this was his 2-volume history of Russian-Jewish relations, published in the early 2000s. In it, he called for mutual repentance. He detailed the long history of pogroms and the oppression of Jews by the Russian state. But, and this is the part that drew so much criticism, he also argued that Jewish people bore a share of the responsibility for the crimes of the Soviet Revolution because of the disproportionate number of Jews in the early Bolshevik leadership.
Which obviously drew heavy criticism for seeming to blame the victim.
Immense criticism. Critics accused him of downplaying Russian anti-Semitism and reinforcing old anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish control. But Solzhenitsyn insisted his goal was simply to create a complete historical accounting where no single group was exempt from moral scrutiny.
He really didn't care who he offended, did he?
No.
East, West, liberals, communists, nationalists. He held everyone to this same impossible, rigid moral standard that he held for himself.
He seemed to answer only to his own conscience and to his God. He continued to write and speak his mind until the very end. He died in 2008 at the age of 89 of heart failure.
And he was buried at the Donskoy Monastery in Moscow, a very traditional burial for a very traditional Russian man.
A man whose life spanned the entire Soviet century. Born during the Civil War, fought in World War II, survived the Gulag, brought down the regime's moral reputation, and lived to see it all fall.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, how do we summarize such a colossal, complicated figure? He seems like a man of just endless contradictions.
He absolutely was. A victim of the Gulag who ended up supporting authoritarianism in places like Spain. He was the Soviet Union's fiercest and most effective critic, yet he became a harsh critic of Western freedom. He dedicated his life to saving Russia, but when he finally returned, he felt like a stranger in his own land, alienated by what it had become.
But through all of those contradictions, there was that one steady drumbeat we talked about at the very start of this.
Men have forgotten God. That was his diagnosis for everything. Whether it was the unimaginable brutality of the camps, what he saw as the weakness and spiritual emptiness of the West, or the crass greed of the new Russian oligarchs, he believed that without a higher spiritual compass, any political system would eventually fail the human spirit.
It's a powerful and deeply unfashionable legacy. And I want to leave our listeners with that thought from his Harvard address, because I think it's the one that really challenges us the most today.
The warning about legalism.
Exactly. Solzhenitsyn warned that a society based only on the letter of the law, with no shared moral compass, takes scarce advantage of the high level of human possibilities. When we look around our world today, a world of endless regulations, of constant lawsuits and searching for loopholes where we so often ask, can I get away with this? Instead of asking, is this the right thing to do? I have to ask, have we fallen into the exact trap he warned us about all the way back in 1978?
Are we so focused on what is technically legal that we've completely forgotten how to talk about what is good? That is the question he leaves us with.
It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.